Hey guys, it's Christa Watson here from Christa Quilt, and I'm excited that you're joining me for part 3 of Blooming Wallflowers Quilt Along. In this segment, I'm going to show you how we're going to assemble the quilt block units that we sewed last time into this great quilt top. Do you know what another name for this quilt top is called? It's called a flimsy. Isn't that cute? Well, no matter what you call it, we are going to finish this up in record time so that we can get to my favorite part, the machine quilting. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. That's all coming in due time. If you have a design wall like me, this makes the layout process so much simpler. But even if you don't, look for a nice flat area so that you can lay out your units. You want a nice floor or maybe a bed, or if you want to learn how to make my design wall, be sure to check the comments because I have a tutorial that you can follow along. So the hardest part about this quilt top is laying out the blocks in the correct order. So make sure you check the pattern, take pictures as you go. You want to make sure everything is laid out in the correct orientation before you start sewing. But you're going to have so much fun, I promise. So let's dive in and get started. I'm showing you how I laid out the blocks on my design wall in record time. Too bad I'm not this fast in real life, right? This time lapse represents about 45 minutes in real time, so it's still not too shabby. I've organized the sewn blocks by color onto a table nearby so I can pick them up and lay them out in the correct order. You can enlarge the pattern cover or online image of this quilt and print it off as a visual aid if that helps. Refer to the quilt pattern layout to make sure you are arranging the right number of blocks in each row and that all the background triangles are turned correctly. If you are doing a super scrappy version, take the time to arrange your blocks in a pleasing color placement. It's easy to get these blocks turned around, so just go slow and double check everything before you start sewing. Once my units are all laid out, I took a picture with my iPhone. I'll refer to this as I sew the rows together. For this time lapse, I'm taking off all the units in order and stacking them into pairs so that they'll be sewn right sides together. I'm keeping them oriented the same way the whole time so they don't get turned around. There are a few pieces left on the design wall on the rows that have odd numbers of units. I'll add those on at the end of each row as I sew. My entire stack of sewn units is placed right next to my sewing machine so they are in order and ready to sew. This pin indicates the right side to sew on. That green leader scrap will catch those starting thread tails and prevent a big mess. My setting triangles were die cut so the blunted edges will match up nicely. Now, if your setting triangles were cut with a regular rotary cutter, you'll have tips hanging off about 1/4 inch and those can be trimmed away later. The units are small enough that I don't need pins to match them up and sew. I'm using my Aurifil 50 weight cotton thread collection and my stitch length has been reduced to 2.0. I'm using a stiletto to help guide the pieces and I'm making sure my 1/4 inch seam stays accurate the entire time. I'll sew through this entire stack before I stop and cut the units apart. Now it's time to sit back, relax, and listen to a fun audiobook or podcast while I sew. Now that I've sewn my first pass of units, I'll chain cut them with my thread cutter and stack them back up in order. I won't press any of the seams until the entire row has been sewn. This may look like a hot mess now, but I'm doing a time lapse showing how I sewed every single row. I added all the blocks so each row is fully complete before I press. Now that my rows are sewn, I'll press all of these seams open just like I did for my blocks. Use your fingers to open the seams, then run the hot, dry iron in right behind it. I don't like using steam because I don't want to distort my blocks. I also have very hard water where I live, which causes the iron to leak and spit, so I just stay away from water in my iron completely. I'll press all the seams open in the row from the back side. Then I'll flip it over and press it again from the front. I press each and every row the same way. Now that I have my stack of sewn rows, it's time to add them to the design wall again and repeat this process. I like to put the rows back on the design wall after each sewing session so I can ensure that everything stays in order the entire time. I sure get a lot of exercise this way. Here's what that looks like before I start joining the rows. I'll grab 2 rows starting at the upper left and stack them on top of each other with the upper row on top. So each pair will be sewn with the upper row on top. Hold that thought, as later on I'm going to reverse the order next time I do the sewing. I pin my rows with pins sticking out on both sides of the seam. This will ensure my seams won't shift while sewing and the seams pressed open will match up perfectly. Be sure to pull out the pins right before you get to them and don't sew over them. The stiletto helps me keep everything lined up properly. I just pull the pins out and leave them on the machine bed, then use them to pin the next row together. Look how nice and crisp my points are. Now I'll press each section once it's sewn. It's easier to handle these bigger sections that way. I'm opening each seam with my fingers and using a hot, dry iron. Back to the design wall again, laying out my larger sections I just sewed. This time I'm laying out each section starting at the bottom right. This is going to help me reverse the order as I sew. I'll join these together into 4 sets of 2, starting on the lower right. This time I'll stack the rows with each bottom row on top. This will automatically reverse the direction when I'm sewing so that the long rows don't warp or stretch out of shape. Back at the design wall again, and now I only have 4 sections left. I'm so excited, I'm almost done. You know the drill, it's the same process until the entire quilt top is sewn. Now I have just 1 seam left to sew. Once the quilt top, or flimsy, is all sewn together, and I've given it a final press, there's one final thing to do. It's called a victory lap. And you've earned it. I'm sewing around the entire perimeter of the quilt to stabilize the seams. I'm using my 1/4 inch foot, but only top stitching about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. I'll sew around all 4 sides to secure the quilt. This is only necessary when you have seams that go all the way to the edges. If you have borders on your quilt, you can skip this step. I'm really pleased with how my Blooming Wallflowers quilt top turned out, and I hope you are too. Well, there you have it. My Blooming Wallflowers Flimsy is all ready to quilt. But first, I need to sew the backing and baste it together. I can't wait to tell you more about that. See you next time. Just remember, to find any of the supplies you need to make your own Blooming Wallflowers quilt, please visit shop.christaquilts.com.